You're listening to The Money Hour with your host, Tina Mitchell, on Alternative Talk 1150 AM. Now, back to the show with local mortgage expert, Tina Mitchell.
You are listening to the Money Hour at 1150 AM KKNW, the Saturday, December 17th show. You can also listen to my show podcast, Facebook premiere, or you can catch my show on my show YouTube channel. In addition, for more information, you can go to themoneyhour.com. I'm your host and local mortgage expert, Tina Mitchell, bringing into studio each week the best of the best experts in our local market on everything regarding your money. And I'm here to help you in today's economy. And really excited to have in studio, we're going to be talking on divorce and property division with Brent Bohan of McKinley Irvin right here on 1150 AM KKNW. Brent, thank you so much for joining me in studio. Very excited to have you.
Thanks, Tina. I appreciate you having me, and hopefully I can contribute to these excellent segments.
Yeah, absolutely. Without a doubt. I know you will, and very excited to share you with my listeners a little bit about Brent. Is partner at McKinley Irvin, the Pacific Northwest largest family law firm. Brent has practiced family law for over 10 years and focuses his practice on high asset division cases. His clients have included athletes, politicians, and executives. He has been named a Washington Rising Star by Super Lawyers and listed in the best lawyers, ones to watch in the field of family law. He is peer review rated AV Preeminent by Martindale Hubbell, maintains a 10.0 superb rating on Avvo.com, and received the Avvo Client's Choice Award from 2015 to 2019. Quite an introduction and credentials there, Brent, and that's why I reached out to have you on my show. So starting out my time with you, what is the process of dividing assets in a divorce, Brett?
Yeah, so the court and then subsequently parties and practitioners go through 4 basic steps when dividing up assets in a divorce. And the first step is to identify the assets. And that just makes sense because we want to know what we're talking about here. We want to get everything on the table. The starting position is all property is properly before the court. So independent of whose name it's in, we have to know what we're talking about. Once we know what property is there, the second step is to value the property. And valuation can be a little bit trickier than sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's just as simple as going online and looking to see what a stock price is. But for example, valuing a house, given the fluctuation in the market, parties may disagree over the value of a house. So once we've identified property, valued it, then it has to be characterized before it's divided. And the characterization of property is binary. So it's either characterized as separate property or it's characterized as community property. Mm-hmm. Once that characterization has occurred, then we divide the property fairly and equitably. And so I think everybody agrees in divorce cases that property should be divided fairly between them. The fight occurs or the disagreement occurs when people don't agree on what's fair.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure there are situations where they don't want it to be fair, for sure. When you get into the divorce, people are not happy and wanting to share. So, Brett, can you explain what factors determine how property is divided in a divorce?
Sure. So there can be a number of factors that play into this. So when we talk about fair and equitable, that's a very subjective term. So, parties consider and the court certainly, if it gets there, will consider certain factors on how property is going to be divided and whether or not it's fair to divide property in a certain way. And so those factors are things like the length of the marriage. Are we talking about a long-term marriage, 30 years plus, or are we talking about, sometimes proceed marriages that are under a year? And so that can be a factor. The ages of the spouses. Are we talking about spouses that are starting their careers, or are we talking about spouses that are ending their careers or somewhere in between? Their income levels. If there's a discrepancy in income level, that can certainly have play a factor in it. If you have one party that is earning significantly more, for example, if you have a party that's earning significantly more than the other party, while we do have tools available to us, for example, spousal support to kind of put those parties on more equal footing for some time in the future, property division can also be a way that the court or parties can achieve that goal by granting or agreeing that one party, the financially disadvantaged spouse generally, is going to obtain a higher percentage proportionate share of the property in the case. So income level can certainly have an impact on it. Along with that, education levels, one of the parties is going to need some education here after the divorce to get themselves back on their feet. The existence of non-marital resources. So sometimes you have parties that have access to a trust. That's certainly going to play into how to fairly divide property. One party may have a medical condition that they can't work, and they may need a greater division of the assets. There could be a prenuptial agreement. Tina, we could probably do a whole segment on prenuptial agreements, but that certainly has an impact on how property is divided if one exists. And, whether a couple live together prior to the marriage. So there's a number of factors that play into how property is divided.
Yeah. So being that Washington is a community state property, when is a property characterized as a separate or community property in Washington?
So this is a good question, because anybody that reads online, they say, oh, Washington is a community property state. What does that mean? So the controlling factor, and this is kind of difficult to understand sometimes, because it's unique to family law. And in real estate law, for example, if your name on the title, if you have your name on the title of a house, well, that controls, you have an interest in the house. In family law, name on title doesn't necessarily control. So the controlling factor in determining whether or not property is characterized as community or separate is when it's acquired. We call it the date of acquisition rule. So if property is acquired during the course of the marriage, it's presumptively community property. If it's acquired before or after the date of marriage, it's presumptively separate property. What difference does this make, Brent? Well, the difference that it can make is that the community property generally belongs to the community, meaning that it's subject to equitable division. A lot of times people say, well, that means it's divided 50-50. Not necessarily, as we discussed. Yeah. It's a fair and equitable division is what the law says. That can mean 50-50, but it can also mean an inequitable division to one spouse, 55-45. 60-40, something like that. And separate property generally belongs to the spouse that acquired that property. Now, there's exceptions to this rule, like there's exceptions to most rules. And for example, if a spouse inherits property during the marriage, even though that property was acquired during the marriage, it's presumptively that person's separate property because it was inherited. So generally the courts, when they look at the property as a whole, they can certainly say, okay, if one spouse has significantly more separate property than the other spouse, then they can, as a fair and equitable division, decide to divide community property inequitably to the spouse that doesn't have separate property. And so those two aspects do interplay, and there are very, very rare cases, and this is why we're not a true community property state. There are rare cases where the court will award separate property, one party's separate property to the other spouse.
Okay. So yeah. And if you're listening to the show today, as you can tell, there's a lot of information to uncover, which is really specific to the individual. And best if you are unfortunately in the situation you're thinking about divorce, you need to get in contact with an expert. And really that's what the show is about, is to bring you all of the experts that you need right now. So Brent, what about the division of debts?
So debt is just divided the same way as property. It's no different. It's characterized exactly the same. If it's acquired during the marriage, it's presumptively a community debt. If it's acquired before or after, it's presumptively a separate debt. It could be, awarded to that party that acquires it. The only caveat to that is there's sometimes debt where, for example, a party may take out student loans during the marriage. but then not work at that job until after the divorce. And so even though that debt was acquired during the marriage, it may be assigned to that party because they're the only party to receive that benefit.
Oh, that's okay. That makes sense. So there's some common sense in this process. So how should someone who is about to possibly go through a divorce and is looking at preparing for asset division, what advice would you have?
That is a really good. So I get this question often from people.
I bet you do.
And so, it's this process can be daunting. It's like, where do I start? It's not, it's not uncommon for one of the spouses during the marriage to be keeping track of the finances and the other party to not know what's going on. So one of the first things I always advise people is to gather as much information as they can. We can certainly gather information during the divorce process, but it's much easier if a person can just go on and get all their bank account information, look at retirement accounts, tax returns, pay stubs, all the financial information so they have a complete financial picture. I also advise people to consult with financial planners if they can.
Yeah.
Another helpful exercise is to figure out a budget that most people aren't used to living on their own. They're used to living with a spouse. So it's good to figure out what their monthly budget is going to be after a divorce. That can help remove some of the uncertainty. And there's sometimes becomes a bit of a tug of war over accounts. So if this is in rare circumstances or high conflict cases, one spouse may say, look, I think, the other person's going to go into this account and clean it out. I might advise them, okay, we'll take half of the money in there so that, that the account isn't cleared out and we have to go through the process of clawing some of that back.
Yeah, so there is some preparation possibly up front. So Brent, as I'm wrapping up my time with you, I want to share, I know your practice focuses on high net worth divorces. What counts as high asset for divorce?
So that's kind of a subjective as well. Some people are going to differ on what they think about this, but I would say high asset is about $1 million in total asset in the estate. I think that most practitioners would probably place it between 1 and 5 million. My cases range from
that's including what you would have equity in a property.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. And so my cases range from about 2 or 3 million on the low end to about, I think I have a few over 100 million in total estate.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. And tax concerns, last question before I wrap up the show. I have less than a minute here. So tax concerns needed to be considered. Can you give a quick answer on that?
Sure. So I should just say that I'm not an accountant. So if people have a specific question about taxes, I usually direct them to an accountant. But there can be all kinds of tax implications after a divorce. If you sell a property, if you have to pay spousal support, even since I've been practicing, that's changed twice. Who's going to pay the taxes on the support? Either the person paying support or the person receiving it. So that could potentially change. So that's a consideration. There's also retirement accounts, stock options, if you're cashing those out, any type of deferred compensation. And if there's children, who's going to claim the children as dependents on the taxes?
Yeah. So there's a lot of things regarding taxes. And again, it's all in the preparation. Working with the best of the best in this arena is important. That's why I brought Brent into the show. And also to make sure the attorney that you're choosing, that they have their power team together. Because as Brent mentioned, he's not a licensed CPA. He's not a licensed financial advisor. He has his team together to where he can direct and get you connected and work together with those power partners as an entire team around your divorce to make sure that you're maximizing what you're taking out of the divorce and you're minimizing what you're having to put into the divorce. Brent, thank you very much for joining me on my show. I really appreciate it and look forward to having you back as well.
Awesome. Thanks, Tina. I really appreciate you having me on. Thank you.
Absolutely.